Good morning, Dr. Music.
Good morning.
Could you introduce your work in London, in Tavistock Clinic?
In London, I work as a consultant child and adolescent psychotherapist at the Tavistock Clinic, mainly with traumatised and maltreated children. I also work privately with adults, therapeutically. And recently, having worked for over two decades, children who've been fostered or adopted or suffered different forms of early maltreatment, I've moved to working more with forensic patients at the Portman Clinic, where we work with abusing patients and violent patients. And I've for many years had an interest in the interface between the developmental science research like neurobiology, attachment theory, developmental psychology, and its applications to psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic thinking, and particularly our therapeutic technique. So my writing, my thinking is primarily motivated by trying to integrate these different modalities into something which feels coherent and useful.
Portman Clinic is different from Tavistock Clinic to separate units or something else?
Interesting question. Well, they are part of the same overall organisation. It's called the Tavistock and Portman NHS Trust, but the Portman has always kept itself separate, mainly because it works with very complicated, often very perverse, very difficult patients who should not come into contact with other patients. So, for example, we work with patients who might sexually abuse other people, who might be involved in watching and using child pornography, or who are very violent and dangerous, who have been in prison. And so for this reason, we keep the Portman Clinic separate, even though it's part of the same organisation. In fact, it's only in the back garden of the Tavistock. But for all intents and purposes, even though the management structure is the same, we try to keep ourselves separate to protect everybody, really.
Okay, I will put my first question. Consider the following point of view of the struggle between nature as amount of natural instincts and drives and culture as environmental disposal, struggle who Friedrich Picard in Introduction to Psychoanalysis complemental series. What kind of change the amount of knowledge about the definite reciprocal mutual influence between nature and culture could represent for psychoanalysis? I refer to your first book, Nature in Natures. Could we consider in future psychoanalysis should be more epigenetic? I mean, should take into account more accurately the multiple interaction between genes, cultural disposal, and multifactorial psychopathological consequences?
Okay, so thank you. Very interesting but complicated question. I think we're living in very, very exciting times, and it's very hard to predict what the state of knowledge about therapeutic work will be in 5 years, let alone 10 or 15 years' time. It's true that we can no longer think about either nature or nurture as being dominant. In effect, that question no longer makes sense. It's true that we're born with all kinds of predispositions. We might not just call them drives now. A predisposition for relationship, a predisposition for being taken care of, a predisposition for various things. And I think we've rethought the predispositions we're born with. We think less about being born with destructive, aggressive drives, I think, now. And I think many people think more about those aspects of the personality as defensive reactions to different kinds of experiences. Since the developmental research, since attachment theory, since neurobiology, and since epigenetics, I think we're faced with some very big challenges in terms of at what level we work. I would argue that actually whatever we're doing therapeutically, we're working at a bodily and epigenetic level, even when we're just having mental and psychological conversations. That there's no question that effective therapeutic work will be having a very profound effect on one's whole being, and one that would include different genetic predispositions being turned on or turned off by different kinds of interpretations, different kinds of interventions. But I also think it requires then that now we're much more aware of the very specific culture that a patient comes with, our own very specific cultural prejudices and expectations, the way in which a patient will adapt always to its their current conditions and their previous conditions, the culture that the patient brings with them from their past, which has been a successful adaptation maybe to their past, that might be an unsuccessful adaptation to the present. And such thinking requires us to be thinking and working at many different levels, and I think that includes working at a level of much more bodily awareness and awareness of history and much more awareness of the real current relationship. And I think it changes the transference in a different kind of way. It makes us much more aware not just of archaic fantasies, but actually how we're being perceived in this moment. So for example, if I move quite quickly, my patient flinches, I need to think about what is in his past that's given rise to this very swift movement. How am I being perceived bodily, let alone psychologically? So I think the current research is really, it's exciting, but it's still at an early stage. And we can't predict for sure what the effect is going to be on psychoanalytic therapeutic work in the long term. There are very interesting questions around. For example, would it be that somebody with one allele rather than another allele, in terms of genetic inheritance, might actually be more likely to benefit from psychoanalytic work than other patients? So we found already that certain forms of parenting interventions are more effective with people with some genes rather than other genes. So who knows, that's one area we don't know about. I think the area of neurobiology opens up all kinds of interesting doors. We'll be able to measure how well we're doing therapeutically by measuring a patient's heart rate variability, for example, or looking at changes in the brain. We just don't know if those changes are coming or not. But I think what's clear is biology, culture can no longer be separated, and we know that experiences are having an effect in turning on or turning off from different kinds of genes. We see this in other species as well as humans, and the exciting thing is we don't know where it will all end.
Okay, the second question is, do you think the silent revolution in babies and infant competence, in early empathy and social attention, connected with the importance of emotional regulation, could change or help elaborating historical psychoanalytic ideas on inborn, natural, evil of mankind, who are very close to Hebraic or Christian holy scriptures, on natural human instinct to be inclined to the evil? Could this also help elaborating the classical psychoanalytic ideas on necessary prohibition and control of aggressive tendency by parents who put inside babies their own morality and the ethics issue of society? What could remain of concept of superego inside a cooperative and altruistic conception of the baby? Could it be connected to conventional or moral rules?
Again, a very interesting but complex question, and you need a whole book to answer it. I think what we've learned in the last few years has really revolutionised how we understand human development. And what we know very clearly is that as a species, we're born with an incredible propensity to be cooperative, generous, kind, and open to other human beings, open to their thoughts and feelings, but only if the situation warrants it and is safe enough. So we're an incredibly adaptive species, and it makes no sense at all to be kind and generous in the face of threat, aggression, violence. In those situations, those capacities need to turn off in order that we survive. And then we will function from much more primitive parts of our brains and our nervous systems, where we see much more overt aggression, violence and abuse, and lack of trust and lack of empathy. These prefrontal areas of the brain in effect turn off in response to high levels of trauma, as they do to high levels of neglect. So it's not that we're born naturally good or naturally bad. We're born with a capacity to adapt to our current situation and context, and if the context warrants it and we're born into a loving, safe, empathic, kind, generous family and context and neighbourhood, then we're much more likely to be generous, open, cooperative and altruistic, and our morality will be much more driven by empathy and caring for other people. It will be less of a rule-bound morality. The superego still has a very important part to play in explaining morality, partly because there will always be rules in a society or in a family that people will need to follow or be expected to follow. So it's not just this one or the other, but they will always be both. But also some family constellations will be much more likely to be more rule-bound, and so have much stronger superego externally, internally, than other families where the way of thinking morally will be much more empathic, spontaneous, generous, and coming from a different part of the personality. There's always, it links as well with our understanding of left and right hemispheres, in fact, as well. And I've lost it a bit. I think when we think about our moral sense, we have to be quite careful. The effect of trauma and abuse and maltreatment and neglect will be to turn off all kinds of capacities to be moral and to be kind. And in extreme circumstances, we see highly psychopathic responses. And one of the really interesting things about this is that it's about the signals that we're receiving from our bodies in response to external signals. And so, for example, the psychopath won't read danger and they won't read worry or upset. And so they will be able to act without any of the things that slow most of us down and stop us, inhibit us from doing things which are immoral and bad, if you like. And I think something similar of a mild aversion happens after trauma and abuse as well.
In observing typical dumbness and flat state of neglected babies or infant adolescents suffering from serious negligence, what could be the clinical difference between a lackness of developmental and rational patterns and a defense against the trauma? The question is an important psychoanalytic issue. Do we in psychotherapy work at fundamental lack of evolution or neurobiological models, or work at defenses against anguish and sense of catastrophe? And again, in the case of fundamental lack or basic in the subjective regulations, could it be reasonably helped and treated in effective outcomes?
I think that there's a fundamental difference between people who suffer bad things happening to them, like violence, for example, and people who don't experience the good things that we need, like love, nurture, care. And so babies or children who are born into environments where there's massive neglect, a lack of good experience, they often develop a very dampened down system. They become very flat, they become rather dead, they become hard to reach. That is a trauma in a sense. They're responding to a trauma, but the result is very different the result is a lack of development, a lack of liveliness. So the child who's been overtly traumatised, who's maybe experienced violence, will be very vigilant, they'll be very jumpy, they'll be alert, they will be reactive. Whereas the child who's received very little input, they'll be flat and dampened down. So of course, these are two very different personality presentations, and they require a very different therapeutic response. And I think there's a danger in working with people who have had a more dampened down experience, who've been more neglected, is that some of them can present to us quite coherently intellectually and cognitively, but with a very, very flat affect. And there's a danger that we get taken in by the content of their words, and we get taken in by the idea that they've maybe developed defences against different experiences, and what we forget is actually there's a lack of genuine emotional development at the heart of their beings. And I think that in order to work with that, we have to be much different very different in our therapeutic technique. We have to develop a much more active technique. We have to do what Alvarez described as a reclamation. We have to show that we're a live presence for them. And I think the danger is that if we think about them in terms of levels of liveliness, if you've been very traumatised, you might be up here somewhere. Maybe most of us are down here somewhere. Some of these very neglected children are right down here in terms of energy levels. So if we join them down here and stay there, we're never going to help them come up to the level that they need in order to take a real place in life where they can become emotionally vibrant and alive, capable of real relationships, have emotional vibrancy. And the tragedy is then they're living often quite wasted lives, quite dead, cut off lives. And another difficulty is that we often allow this to happen because we don't worry about them, because their flatness gives rise to a lack of responsiveness in us, and we don't take seriously the deadness and the need to bring this deadness alive and to help facilitate the developmental processes that they so badly need.
Okay, from the last answer, you said something interesting about the change in technique. But the question I will put in last is, considering the social, the private environment of the baby or the children in therapy, do you think could be interesting or is necessary to work alone in a psychotherapy with a child or adolescent, or is important to be helped by other colleagues working with family or in neighborhood, etc.?
Again, a very interesting question that I won't give you a direct answer to because there's no right answer. I think that for many children, individual psychotherapy can be incredibly useful, as we know, and I wouldn't ever want to suggest that it isn't useful. I think for some children, we need to be working with the system around them, and we need to be working with the parents and the family and the school, for example. So you might get a child who is very, say, angry, acting out, difficult to control, emotionally dysregulated. And the school might say, or the parents might say, he needs therapy. So you take him to therapy, and the therapy becomes a kind of dustbin for bad children. And the hope is, from the parents or the school, that you will cure this child and bring back a nice, happy, compliant child. I think there's a real danger in this. And I think that, first of all, therapy becomes a repository for bad feelings and for badness. Secondly, no one out there is really being helped to understand the child, and then to be able to understand similar other children, or to be able to bear and contain what gets stirred up by being in the presence of children like this. So if I find time and time again, if a school is helped to make sense of what's being stirred up in them by this child, so for example, if a teacher learns that this child is misbehaving because they've been very highly traumatized and because bad things are happening at home, suddenly a teacher will maybe develop some sympathy for the child and begin to respond differently to the child, who then in turn responds differently. But they also begin to be able to develop an observational capacity, a capacity to bear difficult feelings, to be able to use their own emotional responses to children, and there becomes an interest and a liveliness. And then what happens is that the hopelessness that gets engendered by these very difficult children can dissipate, and the teachers or the parents become much more empowered, they become more happy and they become more confident, and I think the child improves, and you don't then have the risk of therapy being used as a kind of dustbin for children to be placed when things are going wrong. So I think very often working to help people make sense of emotional and psychological reality from a very unique perspective can be incredibly useful. It's not to say that individual psychotherapy isn't often the treatment of choice, but I think sometimes it's further down the line. And I quite like increasingly to work with families and work with the system first, and then see what the effect of that is before moving into individual psychotherapy.
Okay, I'm grateful for your clear answers. Thank you very much.
Amedeo, thank you very much indeed.